The year 2009. The UN General Assembly. This person is saying the following words. This is a commercial business. Capitalist companies create viruses in order to then produce and sell vaccines. This is very shameful and unethical. Vaccines and medicines should not be sold. Medicine should be free, but capitalist companies produce viruses and vaccines and want to profit. Relevant, isn't it? Let's analyze this illustrative story. Illustrative in every sense. Libya. In a very short period of time, we witnessed its flourishing and complete destruction. How did it happen that a country with a GDP per capita of $14,000, which is better than some Western countries, was practically wiped off the face of the earth? On September 1st, 1969, the famous Communique No. 1 was broadcast on Libyan radio. Citizens of Libya, in response to the deep aspirations and dreams that filled your hearts, in response to your constant demands, for change and spiritual revival, your long struggle in the name of these ideals, heeding your call for uprising, the army forces loyal to you took on this task and overthrew the reactionary and corrupt regime whose stench caused nausea and shocked us all. All sons of the desert and our ancient cities, our green fields and beautiful villages forward. On that day, the movement of free officers, unionists, socialists led by Muammar Gaddafi overthrew the king and proclaimed the Libyan Arab Republic. Thus began a new era, which some would call a time of prosperity, while others would call it a period of tyranny and despotism. Gaddafi began by expelling all international corporations from the country and closing NATO military bases. He then focused on building statehood, from uniting tribes living in shared territories to a modern state. This was the main slogan of Gaddafi's first decade in power. But the disparate tribes had no need for any form of statehood. Many were dissatisfied with the new policy, and opposition forces were growing stronger. To maintain power, Gaddafi turned to his tribe, surrounding himself with loyal people. At that moment, he realized that a different path was needed, and he found it by creating a unique form of statehood that was impossible anywhere else. Thus, neither a republic nor a monarchy was formed, but the great socialist People's Libyan Jamahiriya, a peculiar hybrid between a tribal system and a centralized state. The experiment turned out to be very successful. From a remote area in the middle of the desert, Libya transformed into a country with a very high standard of living. Just look at these figures, which we can only dream of now. The state annually paid $1,000 in subsidies for each family member. Unemployment benefits amounted to $730, and the average salary of a nurse was $1,000. Upon marriage, newlyweds received $64,000 from the state to purchase an apartment. And for each newborn child, the family received $7,000. Not a bad start for a new unit of society. If someone decided to start a personal business, they received a one-time financial aid, $20,000. Moreover, large taxes and levies were prohibited. Education and healthcare were free. Furthermore, if someone decided to study and intern abroad, it was funded by the state. There was also a special network of stores for large families with symbolic prices on basic food products. There were no utility payments. Loans for purchasing a car and an apartment were interest-free. Moreover, the state covered up to 50% of the car purchase, and for members of the People's Militia, it provided 65% of the amount. There were also special pharmacies where medicines were dispensed for free. Gasoline was cheaper than water. 1 liter cost 14 cents. Real estate services were banned in Libya, and the penalty for counterfeit medicines was death. The sale and consumption of alcohol were also prohibited. Prohibition law. 3/4 of Libyans were illiterate before 1969, and 10% of the population suffered from blindness due to widespread unsanitary conditions and the near-total absence of doctors and medical facilities. Gaddafi immediately began the construction of hospitals, libraries, schools, and universities. By 1977, the literacy rate in the country had increased to 50%, and by 2009 it was almost 90%. What personal qualities must Colonel Muammar Gaddafi have possessed to create such an oasis from the desert in such a relatively short time? Well, he certainly wasn't an angel. Much is known about his love for women and luxury, as well as his cruelty and vindictiveness. Gaddafi's history is full of crackdowns on political opponents. For example, in 1978, the leader of the Lebanese Shiites and founder of the Amal movement, Imam Musa al-Sadr, mysteriously disappeared after arriving in Libya. Gaddafi could reach his political opponents anywhere. It was impossible to hide from him abroad. In the first 25 years of his rule, 8 people died in Italy, 6 in Germany, 5 in Greece, and 3 in the United Kingdom. Gaddafi's enemies were killed in Austria, Spain, Cyprus, Lebanon, Malta, Poland, Romania, Saudi Arabia, and France. He eliminated them methodically and cold-bloodedly. Gaddafi was definitely ruthless, as in fact are all those who play big on the global chessboard. For example, the USA with its Guantanamo atomic bomb explosion and executed Saddam Hussein can hardly be called kind and just. There is an even more striking analogy with the head of Chechnya. There is even a special term, enemy of Ramzan Kadyrov. Such people also do not live long, and wherever they go, in whichever country they try to hide, death usually finds them there as well. This is overall a very interesting comparison. After all, Gaddafi led Libya at the age of 27. Kadyrov also came to Chechnya at a very young age. Skillfully distributing the oil that Allah provided, Gaddafi established a regime of unlimited power, trampled the political field, and eliminated even the slightest possibility of opposition maturing. Any kind of opposition, and all this against the backdrop of a paradise on earth for himself and his closest circle, and a strange form of socialism for his fellow citizens. Well, there is also much to say about the earthly paradise. The exact number of mansions and villas owned by Gaddafi, scattered around the world, is unknown. According to Libyan media, the personal fortune of the leader of the Jamahiriya exceeded $200 billion. The colonel had a particular fondness for gold. From this precious metal, a mermaid-shaped sofa, an AK-47 rifle, a watch, a golf cart, all the cutlery, and even a fly swatter found in his house were made. Gaddafi's personal aircraft, an Airbus A340 with a full-size jacuzzi on board, was decorated with silver. Clothing, plastic surgeries in a special bunker, world stars for birthdays, virgin bodyguards, all of this cost enormous amounts of money. It even got to the point where the colonel would take tents with him. Along with them came live camels, so that the Libyan leader could start each morning with a glass of fresh camel milk. Subsequently, trips abroad with camels became a tradition, one way or another, to create what eventually became of Libya. And yes, in quite a short time, one needed to possess very specific human qualities. Well, or perhaps not entirely human. But this question is more about the ruling class of society in most countries of the world rather than specifically about Gaddafi. For example, how to enter the circle of the world's leading intelligence services. Gaddafi did this in a rather original way, which, truth be told, a normal person would never understand. He began to support leftist radical and national liberation movements all over the planet. In doing so, the distinctions between the people's aspirations for freedom and terrorism were, to put it mildly, very blurred. Intelligent people understand that acts of terrorism are, in the vast majority, not the insane actions of religious fanatics, but carefully planned operations by intelligence services and agencies of various countries. At that time, Libya was supporting with money and weapons about 30 extremist organizations, including ones like the Irish Republican Army and the Basque ETA, the Italian Red Brigades, the Japanese Red Army, the West German Red Army faction, the Palestinian Abu Nidal group, and many others. In 1986, an explosion occurred at one of the discos in West Berlin, which was frequently visited by American military personnel. 3 deaths and 200 injured. Intelligence services quickly detected Gaddafi's involvement, and years later this information was confirmed. In response, a targeted bombing of military targets in Tripoli and Benghazi was carried out, resulting in the deaths of dozens of civilians. Sometime later, in December 1988, a passenger Boeing 747 exploded over the Scottish town of Lockerbie. 270 people were killed. 15 years later, to lift international sanctions, Libya admitted that its officials were responsible for the plane explosion. In September 1989, an airplane operating flight UTA 772 crashed to Earth. From Brazzaville to Paris, 179 people died. And the same situation, 15 years later. In 2003, Gaddafi announced his decision to pay compensation to the victims of the tragedy, emphasizing that he did not consider his country responsible for the attack. Our dignity is important to us. We are indifferent to money. The Lockerbie case is already over, and now the UTA case is closed as well. We are opening a new chapter in our relations with the West. It is believed that the plane bombings were organized by Libyan intelligence services on Gaddafi's orders as revenge for the bombing of Tripoli and Benghazi. This was the action of a man who came to power at the age of 28 as a result of a coup and managed to hold on to that power. For more than 40 years into his 70s, few have achieved this on the world political stage. But what was Gaddafi's most significant crime that they simply could not forgive him for? Western powers. Gaddafi seized upon a very ambitious goal to strengthen African countries as a whole. He had the audacity to propose to African states the idea of ceasing to be a post-colonial appendage of the West. He wanted to change the fate that the USA and major European players had long prepared for these countries. And most disturbingly, he was taking concrete steps in this direction. The dollar-based monetary system absorbed all African countries, exploiting their natural resources such as oil and mineral raw materials. To change this dire situation, Gaddafi planned to introduce the gold dinar as the main currency. Colonel Gaddafi had a global plan to create a strong union of African states that would rely on this new economic system. The colonel proposed this advantageous alternative, primarily to the Islamic states of Africa, but also offered the opportunity for all other African states to join the union. The next rebellious step Gaddafi wanted to implement was to free his oil market from the dollar. According to the US OPEC agreement of the 1970s, Libya traded oil, specifically in dollars, which was naturally beneficial to the Western participants of the agreement. If Gaddafi had done this, other African and Middle Eastern oil and gas producers would have followed suit. Gaddafi's new plan meant the creation of an entirely new African banking system that would not depend on Western, French, and British central banks. The West would hardly have been able to withstand such a blow to its system. Therefore, the global elite could not allow this in any form. There was another reason, also related to resources but not to oil. Libya, Egypt, Chad, and Sudan are floating countries. They are located on a vast mass of Nubian porous sandstones, covering an area of up to 2 million square kilometers and with a thickness ranging from 140 to 230 meters, containing enormous water reserves. The Libyans stumbled upon this fortune quite by accident. They discovered water in 1953 while trying to find oil sources. Only a couple of decades later, with the arrival of Gaddafi, did the country's inhabitants realize that they had stumbled upon a true treasure. Gaddafi began implementing one of the most grandiose projects in the history of irrigation systems. The colonel called it the Great Man-Made River. The construction of this large-scale structure could have transformed arid Africa into a flourishing continent. This was precisely what Gaddafi aimed for. Initially, under his careful guidance, a project for a complex network of pipelines was developed. Their task was to deliver water from the Nubian aquifer to the arid regions of the country. Next, specialists from South Korea were invited to Libya, bringing with them the most advanced technologies of that time. Then, in the city of Al-Burak, a plant was launched for the production of reinforced concrete pipes with a diameter of 4 meters. On August 28, 1984, the construction of the pipeline began, which since 2008 has been considered the largest irrigation project in the world. And this is even in its unfinished state. Gaddafi's plans included not only supplying water to the country's cities. In the future, it was planned to cultivate and irrigate hundreds of thousands of hectares of land. And, besides Libya itself, to include other African countries in this system. What would have happened in the end? Africa would not only cease to be a perpetually starving continent, but it would also become an exporter of agricultural products. Western countries could not allow this to happen. After all, many of them were involved in supplying food to African countries. It was completely unprofitable for them to transform Africa from a consumer into a producer. Moreover, the rest of the world had long been experiencing a serious shortage of fresh water. Almost 20 years ago, back in 2003, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan stated that 2 billion people were desperately in need of fresh water. And so, according to World Bank estimates, by the middle of the 21st century, 40% of the Earth's population will experience water shortages, and 20% will suffer seriously from it. It turns out that possessing water automatically elevated the Libyan leader to the ranks of global leaders. At a ceremonial event dedicated to the completion of one of the stages of the Great Man-Made River project, Muammar Gaddafi spoke prophetic words. Now, after this achievement, the threats from the USA against Libya will double. The Americans will do everything to ruin our efforts and oppress the people of Libya. And already by mid-February 2011, mass anti-government demonstrations began in the country, which quickly escalated into an armed conflict between government forces and the opposition. In March, a military invasion of Libya by an international coalition, which included NATO countries, began. By the end of August, with the support of NATO aviation, opposition forces captured the Libyan capital, Tripoli. Everything was unfolding according to the now familiar scenario. Next, an independent strong leader was supposed to emerge as if from nowhere. With the help of the armed forces, he was supposed to restore order in the country and create a nation convenient for the West with a democratic facade. But something went wrong. After the fall of Muammar Gaddafi's regime, the country effectively fragmented into several territories controlled by different groups. It was precisely after Gaddafi's overthrow that international terrorists began to flood into Libya en masse. Their influence on the internal political situation in the country continues to grow. The most terrible consequence of the civil war in Libya was the death of several tens of thousands of people. A huge number of ordinary citizens lost their homes and began to emigrate to neighboring countries and Europe, risking their lives. By destroying the system that Gaddafi had created, Western democracy did not quite get what it expected. But no one is going to admit their mistakes. After all, the main message was still conveyed. The world does not have the right to change against the will of those who call themselves the elite. This does not, of course, exhaust the topic of Libya, but the time for our broadcast is not unlimited. So we will be wrapping up. Let us know in the comments if we missed something in this episode. Or do you think the issue lies elsewhere? Thank you for watching and see you on our channel.